Hi everyone, and this video is for the first week of Islam. I'm not really going to talk specifically about Islam. I sent you a video from last year that expressed some things that are still relevant to me today in terms of our openness to Islam. I am going to send you really kind of a set of notes on the feminine in Islam, which may help us to be open to it. It is a religion that has one phrase that I came across while I was researching was hypermasculinized. It's become hypermasculinized, but this wasn't true in its origin, and so we could certainly have judgments or opinions about Islam as it has become, but in this course we're going to want to see past that to a kind of the essence, the heart, the religion, and it's going to be easier in next week when we deal with Sufism, which is obviously an amazing tradition, and we'll see how that goes. We get into that, but. I just wanted to remind you, I sent out an email, but I want to remind you for the purpose of the purpose of the experience reports is that you can each share in each other's experience, each other's experience with the practices. So please read. It's part of the enriching nature of the class that you would read everyone else's experience of the practices, and I think it makes a significant contribution to our kind of collective sense of experience, as opposed to our collective sense of the theoretical content, if you see what I mean. So I do think it's important to have that component. It's an important part of the class. Okay. I wanted to talk more about. So this is going to be, this is a kind of an ongoing issue. I mean, this week we had some what I thought were really, really great discussions about asceticism, the component of asceticism and mysticism, and is that intrinsic or not? Is the question? The question is out there. Some are more on one side than the other. Don't think there are right or wrong answers to these things. There's in the sense of Ken Wilber, there are multiple perspectives possible, and in fact, taking the multiple perspectives is a very worthwhile thing to do. It's a very desirable thing to do, because ultimately we've got to be bigger than one particular view. We've got to take this aperspectival approach ultimately, where we, our beings, are bigger than any one particular view. So I think that is helpful. With respect to mysticism in general, I wanted to tell you a little bit. I'm just sort of really getting into this book, and it's The Foundations of Mysticism by Bernard McGinn. He's a pretty famous scholar of mysticism. He's also got a kind of, he's definitely a scholar, so there's that academic component, but he has a kind of a sensitivity to the spiritual as well. So it's an interesting combination, although it's kind of heavy duty. All I wanted to refer to out of this book. In this book, this book is one of, believe it or not, it's thick. It's one of 4 volumes, and this one covers the origins of Christian mysticism. So back to the life of Christ, at the time of the life of Christ, up to the 5th century. So it's really kind of foundational in the sense he's really looking at how Christian mysticism got rolling, and then what were the influences on it. But in looking at that, it's impossible to not get into what mysticism is in general, right? The term mysticism, I think it's fair to say, arose primarily within Christianity. So it's something we when we say mysticism now, we think sort of very broadly, but I think at first it was a kind of Christian concept, even though it existed obviously in other traditions as well. And the term mysticism is actually quite recent. We're talking 17th century, late 17th century, and so there wasn't like an idea that there was a thing called mysticism until very recently. But there was, and this guy makes this point, there was what he calls mystical theology. And there were certainly what we would now label as mystical writings. But, you know, until the 17th century, there wasn't this idea that there was this thing called mysticism. So, but there was a mystical theology, and there were certainly people living a mystically based kind of life. You see what I mean? But we're labeling it that in retrospect, basically. Bernard Begin makes the point that he is making the point, and this is probably controversial, and we could actually sort of debate it, but he's making the point that you can't really separate mysticism. We have this idea that there's an experience, there's a mystical experience, and that is really the heart of what mysticism is the mystical experience. And he's saying, yeah, no, not really. He's saying, yeah, you know, certainly there is experience, but it always occurs in a context, and it occurs in the context of the mystical theology. So it's like what it is you think you're doing when you're living this way and doing all of these practices. What you think you're doing, he's like, yeah, and then on this road, experiences will happen or may happen, and but they're experiences that occur within a context, right? And really, you can't really sort of pull the experience out of the context. Now we're in a sort of in a way in an active debate, because at the end of this course we're going to have to consider the question as whether all religions have a common core kind of truth, and we often might think that that's a kind of mystical truth, that there's the core of all religions are kind of doing the same thing. But he's saying, you know, this notion of experience separate from context is not, at least from an academic perspective, it's not tenable. Really, you can't just pull it out of the, and then you will see that although the mystic lives a certain way and has certain experiences, and then expresses from those experiences, that expression will take the form that's a particular form that's influenced very much by context. So within the context of Christianity, you're going to get an expression of the experience and the life that is particularly Christian in this example. And coming up, we're going to get perhaps the same thing with respect to Islam. Okay, so that's just an interesting thought that you know, this context-dependent nature of things is an interesting thought, and we can disagree with that. I mean, we don't have to believe just because he's an academic and write thick books. We don't have to agree with it. And in fact, there's a famous book on mysticism from the early part of the last century by a woman called Evelyn Underhill, very well known, and she probably wouldn't agree with him. From reading her views on mysticism, she's got an entire book on mysticism. She might take an opposing view. Well, there we go again, aperspectival. We got multiple views possible. I have a set of notes here. I just don't want to. So One the interesting thing about this book is he's really documenting the influences on Christian mysticism. There's a great influence coming from Judaism, which already had a mystical tradition. There's a great influence coming from the Greeks, the Platonic tradition especially, and there's a word, theoria is a word. Our word theory comes from that word theoria, but it's usually translated, the Greek word is usually translated as contemplation. So theoria obviously makes is an extremely an idea that's extremely interwoven with Christian mysticism, the idea of contemplation, which we were taking a shot at some of that practice this week, or last week in the practice, Lectio Divina. So so in Platonic terms, that there was a kind of an access to a divine realm, the realm of forms, but that access, Ken Wilber would say it's the eye of he would call it the eye of contemplation. So the word theoria is actually related to a word which means to see, simply means to see. So that you actually almost kind of, so there's this idea that, and I mentioned the eye of contemplation, that there is a kind of mode of perception that is contemplative, and so that these divine realms, the forms, the good, the true, and the beautiful for Plato were accessible via theoria. It's via this process of contemplation, basically, and the perception of these things would be perhaps via what you might call an intuitive process, via contemplation, that one was being informed in a certain way of the existence of the divine realms. But this was a tremendous, so point being that this was a tremendous influence on Christian mysticism. But particularly within actually both ancient Greece but perhaps more so in Christianity and Judaism, as we've seen, was he says that mysticism is always textually mediated. In other words, so it's involves the contemplation of texts, and hence there we go again with the context dependent. It's like the text of Christianity, the text of Judaism, texts that might have existed in ancient Greece. Those are all a context within a context of contemplation, which is taking you deeper into this possibility of actual perception, theoria of contemplative perception of divine truth or divine presence. Okay, so that takes us to the definition of mysticism. Okay, so very often the word union with the divine is used as the objective. That's the object of a mystical path, is union with the divine. In Christianity, that's definitely often used. And Bernard Begin says, well, that when you look at the writings of mystics, people we acknowledge as being mystic, first of all, if we used union with God as the measure for which would define a mystic, he's like, there are really very few mystics. He's like, there's very few mystics who really sort of claimed that full on, and then union was only one of many metaphors that were used by the mystics to describe their experience, which is indescribable. So union, and it may not be the most central category. And even when the union is used, there's clearly several understandings of the meaning of that word union. So for Bernard Begin, it's an ambiguous term. It's an ambiguous word union, but and he sort of zeroes in on the word presence, and so he's sort of sliding over to a definition of mysticism that includes becoming conscious of divine presence, and the presence of God, in other words, becoming conscious of the presence of God. That he's saying would form a more central kind of description of the goal of mysticism as it exists in Christianity. And using that definition, one could have a large plethora of examples of mystics that exist in Christian mysticism. So we talked about mystical theology, and by the way, he sort of breaks that down. If you say mysticism, and then mystical theology, that's for him experience and understanding. You have experience, how do you understand it? Mysticism, mystical theology. So we are inevitably exposed to a kind of an attempt to report the experience, which is not really reportable or describable, and it's expressed in terms of understanding, which is essentially a kind of mystical theology, if you like. Okay. So we have the description, his description, which is becoming conscious of divine presence, and he in the process he uses a lot of other phrases. The paradoxical intersection of the timeless and time, a particular kind of encounter between infinite spirit and finite human spirit. Finally, there's this definition. The mystical element in Christianity is that part of its belief and practices that concerns the preparation for, the consciousness of, and the reaction to what can be described as the immediate or direct presence of God. I kind of like that. I kind of like that definition, and I'll throw that out there, and you can think what you think. The experience itself, of course, defies really conceptualization or verbalization, and that, of course, leads to various kinds of attempts to express it, to relate it to those others. And very often, apparently, these texts, which we are reading, in the lives of the saints, and these texts are really designed not to really particularly describe the experience, but to help lead the other, the reader to. That's my phone ringing. Help lead the reader to a kind of transmission, to have that same experience. I just wanted to read you. So there's another aspect to this whole thing. When you use the word presence, so the presence, becoming conscious of the presence of the divine, there's this other aspect that he says comes up. He says precisely because of the incommensurability, which means kind of like incompatibility between finite and infinite subject, Christian mystics over the centuries have never been able to convey their message solely through the positive language of presence. The paradoxical necessity of both presence and absence is one of the most important of all verbal strategies by means of which mystical transformation has been symbolized. So we've encountered this in a sort of way, in that the needing to become an empty vessel, the progress in mysticism being through also a sense of absence, right? So these kind of things sort of come together, thesis and antithesis kind of thing, presence and absence. So that in the descriptive language, we often see a kind of an emphasis on absence, especially from mystics that could be labeled as apophatic. And the way I sort of see that is that, okay, so in the process of becoming aware of the presence of the divine. Okay, so we're in our typical lives, we're kind of habituated to the presence of things around us, the material world, in our world, people, places, and things around us. That's our kind of model for presence. That's we're used to dealing with the presence of things in that way, mediated via our senses. And as one progresses in this sort of consciousness of divine presence, what I think, this is my interpretation, is starting to happen is also the beginning of that typical presence that we're used to starts to seem like an absence. You see what I mean? It's, in other words, because one is discovering, one is starting to make contact with, one is starting to see a far more profound living kind of presence. The usual presence that we are used to of things and people, places, and things is starts to become empty. Unless it is that. So that old sense of presence is sort of a decaying mode, and there's a new kind of alive sense of presence. One is going to experience kind of an absence as well as a presence. The absence is related to how we've seen and perceived the world in the past. There's a new mode of perception that's kind of arising. Now, I'm putting this forward, and this does sort of relate a little bit to my own experience, but you guys can say what you think of it. But it's there's kind of something starts to take over, and in that process, the typical world starts to become empty. And it's so it is possible that one could facilitate this process by almost like consciously emptying the typical world, so that one could be filled all the more completely by this other perception that's coming on, so that one at the end of it is you're only going to see this alive depth presence, that you're going to be living in that mode. Okay. You guys will tell me what you think about that. I've gone on far too long. I wanted to read you some Evelyn Underhill. Maybe we'll slot that in somewhere further down the road, because I don't want to go on too long. Okay, this is just a regular week. I'm going to get to your practice reports and send you some form of acknowledgement and appreciation and feedback of what you wrote in your experience reports. I'll get that hopefully today or tomorrow to you, and that's it. Okay, and again, thanks for all your posts and discussions. Really very rich.